I arrived in Napa Valley just before the light thinned to gold, the hills folding into one another like velvet and the air carrying the faint sweetness of crushed grapes and dry grass. The resort looked unreal from the road, white stone, long shadowed columns, windows so polished they swallowed the vineyard sky, and stepping inside was like stepping into a world that had never considered me. The lobby smelled of white roses and beeswax. Persian rugs ran like streams toward a hall glittering with chandeliers. Somewhere a violin traced a bright ribbon through the din of laughter and clinking glasses. This place was supposed to be a celebration for my younger brother, Ethan Harper, who was marrying Olivia Bennett, daughter of a family whose name was stitched into half the wine labels lining the valley. I wore a navy suit and a careful knot. I told myself I was only here to bless him and go home. But I had that old weight in my chest, the familiar sense that the day would require me to be the steady one nobody noticed. My name is Marcus, 35. A software engineer in Chicago, the reliable son who keeps the code clean, the rent paid, the plants watered. The Harpers never had to worry about Marcus. They worried about shine. Shine was what Ethan did, the quick smile, the practiced charm, the multi-million-dollar deals at his venture capital firm, the way he collected attention like it owed him interest. He once called Olivia his golden ticket, and I pretended he was joking. Today, I couldn't pretend. In the reception area, a gold-embossed placard listed table assignments. I looked for mine and felt the small, stupid sting of not finding it. A uniformed attendant with a bright, trained smile said, "Mr. Harper, of course. Your seat is in the auxiliary area, near the hallway." The auxiliary area was a few small tables by the coat check, plain linens, no roses, no candles. A view of the banquet hall through a glass door as if the party were a museum exhibit. Beyond the glass, my mother, Caroline, in emerald silk, beamed at Olivia with the softness she saved for other people's daughters. My father, Charles, laughed with a man whose watch looked heavier than my car payment. They didn't see me. I told myself I didn't mind. I did. I went to the main hall anyway, weaving through perfume and polished shoes. "Mom," I said. She turned, surprise cooling her smile. I asked why I was seated in the hallway. "Don't make a fuss, Marcus," she said, adjusting a bouquet as if tying off a conversation. "The main hall is for close family and important friends. Ethan needs to make an impression on the Bennetts." It was like being told I wasn't a relative but a utility. My father caught my eye from across a knot of men and offered a neat, dismissive nod that meant not now and also not ever. I found Ethan near the gifts table, laughing like wealth was air and he had evolved bigger lungs. I told him about the seat. He laughed, clapped my shoulder, and said I should be grateful to be invited at all. "It's a big day," he said, as if my humiliation were a minor spill he didn't plan to mop. I returned to the little table by the coats and drank water while the violin soared for a room that wasn't mine. I remembered my 30th birthday. The house lit up. Not for me, but for Ethan's promotion. My mother handing me a tray with a smile that didn't quite include me. My quiet question at the end of the night. Her apology that was a promise to make it up to me that never came. Later she texted that she was too busy and that Ethan needed support, and I was stable. Stable, the word that means invisible if you say it with enough confidence. I stared past my own reflection in the glass door to the roses and the chandelier, and the beautiful world that had learned to go on without me. Then I stood. I didn't come here to sulk near a coat check. If I couldn't belong, I could at least speak clearly. I found Ethan again and asked him to step into the hallway so we could talk without the performance. We stood by a window where the vines ran like printed lines to the horizon, the sunset pouring honey on everything it didn't actually sweeten. I told him not to play games with the Bennetts, that Olivia deserved sincerity, that this marriage required truth because money always extracts a tax from lies. He laughed, louder than the hallway required, and said he had everything under control. He said he would play the perfect husband, make Olivia depend on him, keep her family's trust, and, when the time was right, ensure the Bennett fortune ended up exactly where he wanted it. He said it like weather, not cruel, only inevitable. My anger wasn't new. It was the old ache growing teeth. I told him he was wrong. He smirked like I had just predicted a rainstorm indoors. Then he left me standing in the corridor, a man staring at vines he couldn't name. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a white shimmer like a visitor in a dream. Olivia, hair pinned, eyes bright in a way that meant the brightness had somewhere to burn. She had heard enough to come ask me for the rest. I didn't want to crush anything. I didn't want to be the person who turned a wedding into a courtroom. But her voice had a tremor that was more steel than fear. And I understood she was asking not for gossip but for oxygen. I told her the truth. She didn't cry. She steadied. She pulled a beaded clutch close like it contained tools instead of lipstick, and called the Bennett family lawyer from a quiet alcove off the hallway. Her voice polite the way a scalpel is polite, precise enough to do the necessary work. I heard fragments. Ethan's inquiries about breaking the prenuptial agreement, contingency language, access to family assets in case of divorce. When she ended the call, she looked older and also more entirely herself. Then she called Ryan, Ethan's closest friend, and when he tried to wriggle free, she told him, calmly, that truth would cost him less than silence. He folded. He said, on speaker, that Ethan bragged he'd bet his life on marrying into the Bennett fortune and winning. She thanked him and hung up. I said her name because I didn't know what else to offer. She thanked me without smiling, and for the first time all evening, I felt seen in a way that wasn't about pity, but about reality. She asked me to join a small meeting in 1 hour, and then she disappeared into a side room where the event planner kept spare linens and emergency oxygen for floral arrangements. I stood alone longer than I meant to, the sunset doing its best impression of mercy on the other side of the glass. I told myself I could leave. I had told the truth. I had fulfilled the obligation I wish someone had once fulfilled for me. But I also knew that walking out would be one more quiet exit nobody noticed. I stayed. The summons came soft as a knock I was already expecting. The meeting room was warm wood and low light, the table long enough for 10 and somehow crowded by 5. Olivia at the head of the table, gown bright as defiance, Ethan in the corner with his arms folded like a fortress he believed in. My mother and father seated together, hands clasped like a prayer for a different reality, me by the door, as if I were security or a mistake. Olivia asked me to repeat what I'd heard. I did. My voice steady not because I felt steady, but because the words had become heavier than I could afford to drop. Ethan called me jealous. The old accusation that turns the ignored into the aggressor. Olivia lifted a phone and played Ryan's voice from minutes earlier. Then she produced the lawyer's email confirming Ethan's questions about the prenuptial cracks he might pry open later. My mother made the sound I remembered from a handful of childhood nights when the world refused to fit her picture. My father stared at the wood grain like it could propose an exit. Ethan slumped and said he only wanted a better life, as if the sentence itself could perform the improvement he'd hoped to steal. Olivia stood. She canceled the wedding without raising her voice. She told Ethan to leave the property. Then she turned to me and thanked me again. This time like a colleague who had done necessary work in an ugly hour. I nodded and wanted to disappear. My mother turned on me the way a storm turns on a shoreline that's simply there. She asked how I could do this to my brother. I didn't answer because I had already given the only answer I had. The truth. Even when it costs too much. I left the room and leaned against the cool hallway wall. For a few seconds I could hear my mother's sobs through the wood, and then the sound thinned to the faint scrape of chairs. I told myself to leave. But fate prefers a public stage. Ethan slammed out of the room, face blotched and eyes electric, and pushed through the banquet hall doors like a man who believed volume could reverse facts. The violin cut off mid-phrase. The chandelier light seemed to sharpen. He accused Olivia and me of conspiring against him, as if love were a resource that could be injured by an audit. Guests shifted in their chairs, elegance becoming distance in an instant. Olivia stepped onto the low platform where the 5-tier cake waited for a celebration that had already ended. She spoke quietly and the room obeyed. She told them what Ethan had planned and how she knew. She presented the email, the call. A murmur moved through the hall like a wind crossing vines. People who had been nodding acquaintances of the Bennetts stood and left, or stared at their hands, or at Ethan as if an optical illusion had finally confessed itself. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett sat with stillness that looked like a discipline only money and sorrow teach. Lillian covered her mouth. Edward squeezed her hand as if it were the one strand of rope still tied to the world. My mother rushed to Ethan and promised to fix what could not be fixed. My father stared at the floor as if he could find a verse to redeem us all, and couldn't. Olivia slid off her ring and let it hit the floor with the precise, Surgical sound of a clean cut. The room exhaled. The wedding ended without ceremony. The fiction dropped its props and walked off stage. I stood at the entrance and felt nothing for a moment. Then a hollow relief, then a grief that wasn't about the wedding at all. It was about the years I had agreed to be unimportant because it was simpler for other people if I was. Olivia crossed the room and touched my shoulder. She told me I didn't have to stay. I stepped outside into the last strip of light and breathed something that almost felt like air. I drove back to my hotel with the windows down and the radio off. The vines rolled past like a proof of abundance that doesn't require your participation. I slept through the night without dreaming I had done something wrong. News doesn't take long to move when it's thirsty. Within days, Ethan's firm let him go. The circles that had laughed at his jokes closed like a polite door. My mother called me in long, ragged messages that sounded like a prayer laced with a threat. My father texted that I had disappointed him. I turned off my phone, not because I didn't care, but because each message asked me to pretend the truth had been a choice between loyalties instead of a choice between harm and repair. Olivia sent a short message to say she was okay and that she wished the same for me. I didn't answer, and I don't know why. I opened a wooden box in my closet and tried to hold old proofs that I belonged, photos, a card, a medal that had meant something to someone once, but everything in the box felt like a version of us that had needed me to be smaller. I put the box away. Then I opened a browser tab and booked a flight to Colorado. I had wanted the Rockies since I was a teenager without a language for wanting something that wasn't an obligation. I could picture the switchbacks and the thin air, the way a horizon that refuses to end can empty a person of noise. It felt almost like a plan. Chicago in late afternoon can look like a city forgiving you. My apartment windows face a run of brick that takes shadow well when the buses pass. The light flutters against the shelves like something alive. I sat with a cold cup of coffee and looked at a life I had built to be safe and realized safe had become a disguise. I thought about how many times I had arranged my schedule around other people's storms and called that virtue. I thought about how many times I had smiled to keep a night easy and called that love. The next morning at 7:30 a.m., I turned my phone on long enough to delete the missed calls and let the silence expand again. At 9:10 a.m., I laced my shoes and walked the lakefront until my feet ached in the good way. I bought a sandwich and ate it in the little patch of sun outside a bookstore. I went inside afterward and picked up a trail map of Rocky Mountain National Park, even though I could print one for free. Paying for paper felt like promising myself I would actually go. In the following days, the family group text went strangely quiet, then bloomed again with strategy as if my parents could negotiate time into running backward. They wanted me to apologize to Ethan. Not for telling a lie, but for telling a truth without permission. In one message, my father said that family matters should be handled privately. As if privacy had ever protected me when I needed it. My mother asked me to come home, and I typed and erased 3 versions of the sentence I wanted to send. I am home when I am where I am respected. I closed the conversation instead. The thing about being cast as the stable one is that everyone believes you will keep bearing the weight, but weight teaches you how to measure. And I had begun measuring what I spent against what I received and discovering the deficit was not sustainable. I wasn't angry anymore in the hot, young way. I was done in the older way that looks like peace from the outside. The ticket to Denver hit my inbox like permission. I took the earliest flight I could find on a Saturday, and the cab dropped me at the airport while the city was still rubbing sleep from its eyes. I boarded, closed my eyes at takeoff, and opened them above a color I had forgotten existed, that particular western blue that carries distance the way the Midwest carries weather. I stepped onto the train into the city, shouldered my pack to a small rental car, and drove toward Estes Park with the windows open because I wanted the air to prove it could do more than keep me alive. Trail Ridge Road climbed like a question only the body can answer. I parked at a trailhead, tightened my laces, and followed switchbacks into a silence so complete it made a sound. At 10:20 a.m., the sun was already an intention instead of a flare, and the wind came cold off snow that felt older than my problems. I walked until my legs hummed, until the chatter that had followed me from childhood loosened its grip, until the horizon reconfigured my stubborn interior geometry. I didn't think about redemption. I thought about water moving around rocks. I thought about breathing. I thought about how a person becomes a person again by choosing where to stand. On the ridge, a broad-winged bird swung into a current and let itself be held. I laughed, not out loud. Not exactly, but in that private way your inside self does when something lines up. I sat on a warm stone and watched shadows slide across a cirque, and when I finally took my phone out to check the time, there was a single message waiting. Olivia. From a number I hadn't saved but remembered anyway. She wrote that she was all right, that her parents were shaken but steady, that she had gone for a long drive along the Silverado Trail and cried without breaking, that she hoped I found what I needed. I wrote back that the mountains were a good listener. She sent a tiny bright dot, a laughing emoji she would probably never use again, and then nothing. The good kind of nothing that leaves room. The following week, back in Chicago, I made small changes that felt like risk. I said no to a project that should have belonged to someone else. I emailed a community center about a weekend coding class for teenagers who needed someone to tell them their minds were worth money and care. I called a friend I had neglected because it was easier to be lonely in a familiar way. I walked under the L and didn't flinch at the screech. I didn't ask my mother for updates. When she called, I let the ringer run out and told the truth to the room. I can love someone without allowing them to keep me small. I don't know if anyone heard. The strange thing is how ordinary life looks when you have just changed it. The same cup, the same street, the same handwriting on the same post-it. And yet the day no longer expects you to stand in the corner while other people toast. My brother eventually texted, a single line that was half accusation, half plea. I didn't answer because the next sentence would have been one I couldn't write without lying. I'm not done with my family in the way a person burns bridges and watches the glow. I'm done in the way a person sets boundaries and watches themselves return. In the mirror, my face looked more like mine. I went to my desk, opened the trail map, and smoothed it flat. There were paths I hadn't walked yet, names I wanted to put in my mouth, switchbacks I wanted to feel in my calves. The work emails arrived on schedule. The plants needed water on schedule. My neighbor played the same song on schedule, and still, the city gleamed like new foil. That evening, the lake threw little coins of light at the shore, and I thought about the old lie I'd lived under. That family is always the answer. It isn't. Sometimes family is the first question you must ask honestly. Sometimes love asks you to speak even when it breaks the room. Sometimes the truest loyalty is to the life you are responsible to live. The weeks after Colorado felt different in a way that was hard to name. The city hadn't changed, but it was as if the angles of buildings bent less sharply. The noise didn't pierce as deep. The days stretched without that constant weight pressing on my chest. I realized I was carrying less because I had finally decided what wasn't mine to carry. Work at the software firm was steady, predictable. I wrote code, solved tickets, mentored junior developers who reminded me of myself a decade ago, eyes eager for recognition. But this time I offered what I had never been given. When one of them asked nervously if his solution was good enough, I told him clearly that it was not only good enough, but valuable. His shoulders dropped in visible relief, and I realized how much a single sentence can do when you decide to see someone. That night, I walked home instead of taking the train. The air was damp, early autumn moving in, leaves sticking to the sidewalk. I passed cafes lit from inside, laughter spilling through glass, and I thought about how many years I had walked like a shadow beside windows like these, believing the light wasn't for me. Now I stopped, bought myself a hot chocolate, and sat at a small outdoor table, alone but not lonely. My phone vibrated against the cup. It was another message from my mother. The first words were, apology, but they quickly turned into justification. She wrote that Ethan had always been fragile, that they had to protect him, that I should understand the burden of being the stronger one. I read every word slowly, then deleted the message without replying. It wasn't cruelty. It was a boundary. A few days later, I received an email from Olivia. She had decided to take over more responsibility in the Bennett family business, steering part of the vineyard operation herself. She wrote that she was tired of being managed by men who thought her role was ornamental, tired of being a prize rather than a partner. Reading her words felt like standing again on that Colorado ridge, air sharp and honest, the kind that cuts but heals. I replied this time, simply saying I was glad she had chosen herself. We exchanged a few more emails, nothing heavy, just words from two people who had both learned that truth may shatter illusions, but it also rebuilds foundations. Meanwhile, Ethan had vanished from the public eye. Rumors floated. He had moved to a small apartment. He spent his days online trying to rebuild some version of himself. He was angry, bitter, or broken depending on who spoke. My parents never stopped defending him, but their voices had grown thin, less certain. It was as if the weight of protecting him had finally become too much even for them. I no longer felt responsible. I had finally learned the difference between compassion and sacrifice. Compassion sees others. Sacrifice erases yourself. One Sunday, I visited a local community center where the coding class had begun. A dozen teenagers sat in front of old monitors, their eyes lit with the restless fire of wanting more than what life had handed them. I guided them through simple programs, the kind that makes a cursor dance across a screen or creates a burst of colors with a few lines of text. They laughed, leaned closer, asked questions. In their faces I saw possibility, not the polished, cruel possibility of Ethan's ambition, but the raw, untamed kind that deserves to be nurtured. I realized this was family too, not by blood, but by choice. I walked home that evening under the city lights, tired but lighter than I had felt in years. My phone buzzed again with a new voicemail from my mother. I didn't listen to it. Instead, I looked up at the skyline and thought about the truth I had spoken in that banquet hall. The silence that followed, the shattering of illusions. It had cost me. Yes, but it had also freed me. Family doesn't always mean the people who share your name. Sometimes family are the ones who see you when the others never bothered to look. Sometimes family is the quiet you build when you decide your worth doesn't need permission. That night, I sat at my desk, opened the trail map of Colorado again, and drew a small circle around another peak I hadn't climbed. I smiled, knowing I would go. Because the journey wasn't about mountains or vineyards or banquet halls. It was about choosing, every single day, not to live as someone else's shadow if you've made it this far. I'd love for you to hit like, share this story with someone who needs it, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what family really means to you.